I'll start off this way in the spirit of Michael Hammer. Is Google in the process of re-engineering the world? What's it look like on the other side? And when will we know you're done?
I'm here because Professor Hammer was somebody who I admired, somebody who I took a lot of ideas from. And I do agree with the premise that Google is an example of the kind of world that his work, both as a computer scientist and later as a business consultant, imagined. And what I particularly liked about what his views were is they were the views of a computer scientist, which is sort of me too. And although we're not perfect, I can assure you, we think in terms of scale in a way that a lot of other people don't. And Michael did that, and hopefully Google does that as well. So to answer your question about Google, to understand what we're doing, think about a world of an infinite amount of new sources of information, an infinite number of digital devices, all GPS located, attached to people, with an infinite explosion of information. And imagine the scale of the kinds of questions that you could ask that you could not ask before. You literally could not do it before. So I don't know when we'll be done, but Google is a metaphor, I think, in this conversation about getting the world interconnected. And I've become convinced that people do not understand how profound that revolution will be in everything we do.
We thought we had a pretty good sense from the disruptive effects already. If we still don't understand how profound it will be, give us a glimpse, lift the cover on that. If you've got a cosmic vision, tell us now.
Well, Google is in fact not a company with a vision. Google is a company with a set of values and approaches, and we iterate into this new space. So we don't necessarily argue we know what will happen, but we can see some things that are pretty obvious if you think about them. Go ahead and imagine what everybody here has their mobile phone on, and everybody here has, because of who you are, has very powerful data capabilities and a good browser on that mobile phone. Every one of those mobile phones is connected to the world's largest collection of real-time information, both at Google and at other companies. What are the questions that you can do with that? Well, the most obvious question is, tell me where I am and tell me where I'm going. I mean, not only can we actually tell you where you are, in other words, you are the search, but we can also predict where you're going to go based on your patterns and movements and so forth and so on. So the notion that somehow we had all these questions we could never ask before, I think is a new matter. Why do we teach the old way, since all the world's information is literally on this phone or equivalent to a phone device that you carry around with it? We should learn how to search. When I go to a new place and I'm walking down the street, why is it not searching and saying and producing a constant stream of information about the history, the place, things that I care about? We're moving from this old static model to this new real-time model, and this explosion of real-time information, which all of us live in, and all of us participate in, whether it's with tweeting or Facebook updates or instant messages or so forth and so on, is the defining information paradigm. Another example would be governments. Governments should spend their time actually answering questions rather than theorizing them. You can actually instrument things now. You can actually find out what people are doing and what they actually did and whether a program worked rather than just pontificating about it. Not that data is the highest goal of government, right? But imagine a data-intensive, information-rich environment, it would produce, I think, different policy outcomes.
I promise to get more specific, and I'm sure our audience will as well, but one more kind of just big picture one. I mean, if capitalism and new technologies are about creative destruction, where are we in the arc of creative destruction that comes with this technology, the internet?
I think we're early, which is not necessarily a good message to the people who are fighting it. The internet has this bizarre property that it's changed the economics of a large number of information industries. And unfortunately, the consumers sort of like the new model of information whenever they want it, on any terms, on any device, and so forth and so on. And many of the business models that we've grown up with have assumed scarcity in a world where information technology makes essentially infinite copies available inexpensively. I don't know how it will play out. I do know that it will take 10 or 15 years for the new models for how you monetize content and respect copyright and so forth will really take off. And this interim period is incredibly painful for all the people involved.
You're, I guess, thinking of media companies in particular. A lot of companies have been empowered by the internet.
Well, the fundamental issue in the media company space is that they're both production companies as well as distribution companies. And the content production is of enormous value, the quality, the things that you do, et cetera. The distribution has historically been structured around windows and control and limitations and so forth and so on, and the internet is blowing all that away. So the most likely scenario there is an adoption of either an advertiser-supported model or a subscription model that's independent of the transport. And that shift is a very difficult shift for the industries as a whole.
So what shift comes next? You've talked about very widespread, high bandwidth connections that dissolve the boundaries between media. Describe that for us.
I mean, a simple example is that it's technically possible to have a gigabit per second internet connection through fiber to your home. Indeed, many of the telecom operators are busy doing smaller versions of that. Today in America, which is, by the way, the 14th in broadband leadership, not the first, Comcast is rolling out DOCSIS 3 modems with a 50 megabit subscription, for a reasonable charge for it, of course. Korea has 160 megabit fiber. Japan has pretty universal 100 megabit fiber. This is very, very real. When you get to 100 megabits to a gigabit, the distinctions between cable and broadcast and so forth and DVDs all go away. So an example would be that just as Comcast is bringing out this incredible internet service, they also sell a cable model where you pay for television services that you don't consume. ESPN, for example, if you don't like sports. That model is going to be under attack for obvious reasons because the internet allows you to piece part media out. It doesn't like bundling of this kind.
So we have these constructs of a radio, a television, the internet and text and so on. Do those melt together? Do they become one? Is there just one box or not even a box?
They don't become one. You have one pipe and many devices. And that pipe, for most people, will be fiber optic or some combination of hybrid fiber coax. And maybe eventually, I think maybe 80% of America will be some form of HFC and fiber, and the last high bandwidth will probably be done by wireless. Fiber is significantly faster than wireless simply because in the fiber you can have an infinite amount of broadband, whereas on the wireless you're constrained to whatever provisioning the FCC was able to give the operator. So the effect of this is that for most people you'll have one or more of these connections to your home, your business, where you go, you play, and then all of that content will be available to you regardless of transport, regardless of limitation, and you'll either subscribe to it or you'll pay for advertisements for it.
And what about the base technology beneath this? Is the internet that we have now, the internet we will have? You're an engineer. If you could re-engineer the internet, what would it look like? And is it possible to re-engineer, or is it just accretive, and so the base is the base?
It's a remarkable achievement of humanity. The internet is on par with the development of air conditioning, really important. And you think I'm joking, but without air conditioning you wouldn't have computers, because you need to air condition the computer centers. Electricity, gas, those sorts of things, transportation. There are versions of the internet, there are in fact new designs for the internet which have even higher performance that I'm describing and even better switching, and they handle the kind of latency and performance that we can only imagine today. Many people have argued that the internet, what typically happens is people who don't really understand the technology say, well, it's growing like this, but in 6 to 9 months it'll slow down. You'll discover with such people that all such forecasts are 6 to 9 months from wherever you are today. But that's not in fact true, that the architecture of the internet and its distributed capability really it really was designed to withstand nuclear attack, and it really can scale to levels that we cannot imagine. There have been issues around running out of addresses, for example, with IPv4 and so forth, and all of those have good technical solutions.
Give us a sense of the scale of Google's own infrastructure at this point. We're hearing about server farms the size of cities, or maybe that's just in our imagination. But give us a sense of that.
Well, people like to imagine all of that stuff. We benefit from centralization. So we have some number of relatively large data centers which are attached very near to power dams, literally water systems, because we need a constant supply of base load to power these things. And we don't say the exact number, but think that we benefit from the Moore's law, and we build our own, essentially, supercomputers out of PC components. Connected with them is a fiber optic network that we own and control, which we bought remember everybody built all that fiber, and it was all cheap? Well, we bought a whole bunch of it. Technically, it was a great deal, trust me. And we span the globe with that. And we needed to do that in order to move all the data around. When you look at the scale of YouTube, had we not done that with the growth of YouTube, YouTube would have taken Google out, simply because the amount of video and audio and so forth that is used. And again, those of you who are scientists can do the math in your head, but imagine that number of video streams, even with compression, and yet we've been able to handle it. So we engineered Google in the same way that Michael would have, with a notion of scale. And when you imagine the next set of applications that will be real-time intensive, data intensive, maps intensive, we're ready for that. I would argue, by the way, that one of the things that's going on that people have not, I think, articulated correctly is that you can now have a new dimension on things. You know, using Google Earth, you can actually see the changes that we're bringing to the Earth. And that adding a new dimension to thinking is a very profound thing. It allows us to see things differently. It allows us to decide as a society how we want to address them.
With your energy requirements, and we're open to questions from the floor at any time now, so just stand up or make yourself known as best you can there. Are you energy agnostic in terms of source? Do you prefer to be, to have your plant sitting next to nuclear or hydro or solar, or does it matter?
Well, the company has both committed and indeed is carbon neutral. So every time we put a data center next to a coal-fired plant, it's like really expensive. Mm-hmm. So we try to avoid that. If you back up, almost everybody, and certainly everybody who's educated and can deal with facts, understands, which is not everyone, unfortunately, understands that climate change in aggregate is perhaps the greatest threat to humanity over the next 100 to 200 years, with the possible exception of a nuclear war. And if you're confused by that, I want you to imagine what happens when the Himalayan watershed, which roughly provides water for 1 billion people, is gone for much of the year. And just imagine the sort of human suffering of the things that we're doing. So Google sort of recognizes this, and so for years we've been working in the best way we can to try to help people both understand this and also address our own needs. We have to set an example. So we did lots of obvious things. We insulated our buildings. And by the way, the ROI and the return on investment for improving the insulation, making your businesses more energy efficient, is so obvious, even if you don't believe anything I'm saying, you should still do it. That's why it's such a good business proposition. Just do it. We've then also spent a fair amount of time working on various forms of plug-in hybrids and other kind of power systems that are information intensive to try to improve that. And recently we've been working in a partnership with General Electric around the smart grid. What we've discovered is that if people are aware of their energy usage, they actually reduce it. So typical studies that we've done with people involving power meters, by being aware of the amount of energy they use, they reduce their power by 10%. That 10% affects the peak power more than anything else, and that peak power use is what drives the marginal cost to these operators. So this is billions of dollars simply by having more information awareness. So we look forward to where people will not only be primarily using renewable as opposed to polluting power systems, but they're going to be using information technology in some very, very powerful ways. One final comment is that we did an analysis of this, and this is a relatively sort of political view, but I think it's important to state right up front. It is possible with a relatively moderate investment in the scheme of things to have the majority of America's power systems be replaced by renewable energy systems, both transportation and coal, in the next 21, 22 years, by 2030. And as a result, essentially get off of the oil addiction that we're on today. So this really is in front of us. There's a lot of folks here at MIT who are actually doing a lot of important research to even make my projections even conservative.
Before we leave scale, and again, I'm happy to take questions. It's a little bit hard to see you there, but I'll come to you in just a moment. Scale. Google is enormous. When you look we see a lot of your strengths on the front of vulnerabilities. Do you see your major vulnerabilities as economic or political? And in particular, when it comes to scale, Christine Varney is President Obama's new antitrust chief. I know we all saw the Fortune article, Obama and Google, a love story. But their bottom line was that your scale has become such that you may well be a target of antitrust attention by the federal government. How do you look at that? Are you an out-of-control monopoly, sir?
I can't think of the appropriate response aside from no.
Christine Varney will review the tape later, but go ahead.
That's right. There's a number of different sort of ways of approaching, I think, that subjects. We get a lot of criticism as a company, I think, fundamentally because we're disruptive, and also because we are a scale company, as you said, and then finally, because people care a lot about information. So we're used to that side of the issues, and I don't think that's going to go away. What we do believe is that as long as you're on the side of the consumer, you're pretty much on the right side of all these debates, and that there's a lot of sort of hem and ho, going on and on and on and on about it. But the fact of the matter is, and people will review what we do and so forth, but as long as we're consumer focused, we'll be fine. So Larry Page, in fact, wrote a memo, which early in our years as a company, who said, if we were to become big, what were some of the principles that we would establish? And we've established those. And one of the most important one is that you own your own data. So we don't trap end users. So if you, for example, decide that you're unhappy with Google services, we make it easy for you to take the data that we have of yours, and you can go to a competitor or whatever you want to do. We recently announced the oddly named Data Liberation Front group at Google, whose sole job was to make this actually happen. So we're real serious about it.
But ultimately, antitrust law has maybe less to do with the consumer and more to do with corporate competition, anti-competitive behavior. On that score, as you move into more and more industries, with your throw weight behind you, do you think you're approaching kind of red line?
Well, we do not, and from a regulatory perspective, the regulators are going to be looking at the things we do. We understand that. They have a job to do. We have a job to do. It's perfectly reasonable separation of powers. From my perspective, the internet is the story, not Google. And the fact of the matter is that the technologies allow consumers to do amazing things, and we're in the process of trying to enable those. And again, if it has the property that that innovation lowers prices and has consumer benefits, then I'm all for it.
I could ask all day, but I'm sure there are questions here, and we have Eric Schmidt for just a short and special time. Questions from the floor, sir.
Yes.
Nice to see you.
Hi, nice to see you too.
Nice to see you also.
No,
we're all happy to see you.
I know Eric, so
that's great.
As we heard, Michael was a role model for integrating the spiritual side with his work side and with what he did, and with being able to look to the religious classics and being able to work that into his work. Could you comment on Google's spiritual side other than just don't be evil?
It's not enough?
And also in terms of all the writings and everything and how things were done way back in the past.
Well,
thank you.
Michael was unusually gifted. There are these people who are basically very, very smart, sort of brilliant type people who also have a way of emotionally connecting, right? And Michael had that characteristic, and it's a wonderful thing. It's very, very rare. Google is a corporation, right? So you don't use the same terms for that. And we have some people who are like that, but they're, as I said, they're rare at Google too. So I would describe Google in this context as a company that operates under a set of principles and values. And it's always confounding to people when we actually implement the values that we said, that we really do actually do things that are for the benefit of the consumer, even if it hurts our earnings or hurts our revenue or so forth. And everyone gets all upset. And my attitude is, we told you this is the way we run the company. We run the company for these values. And it's perfectly fine. If you look in Michael's work, his whole notion of going to the customer, going right to them, that every single employee had a notion that they were affecting the world directly by their activities. It's very similar to the way our culture works. So from Google's perspective, we see our mission as making all the world's information available, the vast majority of which is largely unknown. Right? So the fact that we can now automatically translate from languages that you've never been inspired from because you've never been able to read it. So those kinds of things just are phenomenal. If you look at the impact that Google is having in countries that have never fundamentally had very much information, obviously Africa, with the spread of SMS-based search and so forth, it's just a phenomenal impact. And I think that our legacy as a company, I hope, will be similar to his in that we were able to have that kind of connection between information and then the impact that it has on people.
To follow up on that, because it's so important, Google does have so much information on so many people, individually and collectively. That is a lot of power. So what's the source of your principle? Is it just in the person and in the sort of thinking day to day of you and the founders? Is it based somehow more deeply? All things must pass. When you guys aren't running the company, what keeps Google good?
I'm not sure. Well, we're certainly not immortal, but the principles may be immortal. It may very well be that successful companies in the information age really do have to have principles that transcend their leadership, their board, and so forth. There's two reasons. One is it actually becomes the culture of the company independent of the leaders. And people are always focused on our founders and myself, but the company is run pretty semi-autonomously in the sense that people pretty much do what they think best under these principles. But the other reason that these principles might hold is because if we violated them, we would lose our customers very quickly. That you cannot fundamentally run an information-rich business without a compact between yourself and your customers about security and privacy and so forth. And so if we were to sort of go to the evil room and turn the light on, if you will, and all of a sudden do something evil with all of this information that we happen to be collecting in the normal course of what we do, we would not only it would be a violation, it would be immoral, it would be inappropriate, it may be illegal, but we also would suffer tremendously in the marketplace. So there are many, many reasons why the scenario that you're describing looks to me to be, more than a lifetime's of
But
principles.
where would that challenge come from, given Google's just the fact of its omnipresence? Even if you did get a little of the evil light turned on, how would you be challenged? What quarter would that challenge, or could it come from?
Well, it would start with the press. Right.
Well, yes, that would be a criticism, but not necessarily a business challenge.
Well, but in our case, we would be regulated. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why these things. I mean, the threat is usually expressed, by the way, in the inverse, rather than what we would do, but what somebody like with a gun would do to us. I'm thinking of the Patriot Act, for example. So if you are a person who's not in the United States, but your information is in the United States, there are people who actually are very concerned about the application of the Patriot Act laws to information that's held in the U.S. against them. I'm not taking a side on that, although I personally don't particularly like it. But the fact of the matter is, these are very complex political, policy, and legal issues of which Google is clearly subject to. And I want to make sure that everybody knows here that we're absolutely subject to these laws, and they will have to evolve as we collect more and more information about folks.
Questions? Yes.
Yes, since Google has attracted the lion's share of advertising that used to go to traditional media, what do you see for the future of news gathering, particularly investigative journalism? Free news on the internet isn't worth anything if nobody can afford to pay the journalists to gather it to be created in the first place.
Let me answer your question, but I do want to say that we've not gotten the lion's share of advertising. The advertising model overall is about $1 trillion market, and we're not currently planning on that amount of revenue anytime soon. So there's a pretty big gap there. The problem on the media and news, the investigative reporting is incredibly serious. What has happened was that newspapers grew up over the last 100 years with sort of three sources of income, right? Traditional print advertising, and then, classifieds, I forgot the other one. Oh, and actually people paying for them. And they're being subjected to a number of terrible problems. The classified revenue is largely moved online. Print costs are going up. And the targeted advertising that Google and others do works just more efficiently, if you will, for an advertiser than the print ads. And the sum of all that, plus the fact that circulation is declining, is just a horrific problem. The other problem that's not as well understood is that people are spending less time reading the newspaper. While it's true that there are more online readers now than there used to be, which is great, people used to spend many studies. The rough ratio is roughly 20 minutes on the newspaper versus 4 minutes on the online for similar amounts of information. And I worry about that as a cognition issue. People actually know less about what's going on. And it's married by the fact that people are now much more likely to get information from their friends and social communities, real-time networks, and so forth and so on. So these are fundamental shifts that I don't know exactly how are going to get reversed. From a Google perspective, we don't know how to fix the long-term newspaper problem. What we're busy building are advertising products that work in the online world, that will attempt to make up some of the revenue that's being lost because of the transition. The issue, in my view, just trying to be as blunt as I can possibly be, is I don't see, at least in the short term, us making up that difference. In other words, the shift from offline to online. It's a problem that the recording industry has had with CD sales and so forth. It's analogous to that. So I'm not quite sure what we should do. There have been proposals to create nonprofit newspapers. Sometimes the newspaper's response is, well, we're already nonprofits, so not such a good thing. I don't mean to make light about it. So I think we're waiting for some new models of journalism to come out. But if we lose the investigative journalism that you're referring to, it will be a tragedy for America. It really will.
Plenty of newspaper people would say that Google piggybacked on the press in part to reach its current success. You're now a $22 billion company. The situation is so dire for traditional news. There's talk of even government support, which has a load of its own problems attached. Does Google owe something to the traditional media? Should you be sponsoring investigative journalism directly out of your coffers?
We've actually thought about this at some length. If we could clearly just write a check to the newspapers, right?
And they would take it.
And I'm sure that they would. The problem with that is that now you're creating a funny kind of subsidy. You're basically creating a subsidy from us to them without essentially a connection that really makes good business sense. And ultimately, that model doesn't scale. And what we've tried to do with newspapers is they allow us to use their content, I should make it clear. And every one of them could ban us using their content by the insertion of a simple command in something called a robots.txt file. So we're trying to figure out a way to make money together rather than writing checks and then just watching this decline.
They're getting skinnier while you look. Is there a question? Yes.
Yes, just to get back to the do no evil. Of course, if that's going to be more than a slogan and going to truly be a principle behind the company, it very much has to depend on what evil is. And of course, there's no uniform definition on that. And it turns back to how it's defined, by whom, and what the process is. Does Google have, or should Google have, an outside ethical advisory board with some real clout to have some input into this?
Who would you suggest? It's a serious question. I mean, describe this board. What sort of people would be on this board?
I think you could have outside people from a variety of different areas who've had an interest in the question and are balancing really the issues of privacy, and maybe privacy really is dead and we should get over it, against the dream world where, as we're going somewhere, our phone knows what kind of food we like and tells us where we should go for lunch when we leave this talk. But I think that having some outside input, just as for important ethical decisions within a hospital, there will be an ethical board that has people from the lay community, the medical community, the clergy, various areas coming together with input. Would there be some value in that sort of thing as Google grapples with what are admittedly very, very difficult choices?
We have talked about it. So far, we've not decided to create one. The reason I asked who would be on it is usually the problem then becomes, how do you decide who goes on these things? Because, as you pointed out so correctly, there isn't an absolute agreement on these things. And usually, in a don't be evil context, it's really a question about privacy. I can tell you that we spend days and days and days with people who represent the many points of view that you articulated in your ethics board, looking at the privacy questions. The privacy questions are more than just values. They're also legal issues, and there's disagreements within countries, and we have to follow the laws in those countries. And so on a per-country basis, we actually have different rules. So at the moment, we make the decisions. And how does Google make the decisions? We make the decisions by committee. And so we have a set of people, which include legal representatives, government representatives, people who deal with the government, these are Google employees and so forth, who make a recommendation. And that has worked out pretty well so far. So I think your idea is a good one. The question is, how would I figure out who would go on it?
How do you deal with real-time search, real-time information, Twitter, and all the rest?
Twitter's very interesting. Twitter has really exploded in its use in the last basically year as everybody's that sort of new microblogging model. We just recently did an indexing deal with them. We want all of these services to be in Google. The hardest technical problem is the ranking of real-time information with the other stuff that's within the web. It's very difficult to know whether a tweet, if you will, using that as an example, there are many other examples that are not Twitter. It's very hard to know where to put that compared to a web result and a video result and so forth. And that's an area of great computer science research for us.
But what do you do about that? I've heard you mention many others besides Twitter, but Twitter's pretty big, and they're working with Microsoft, I think.
Well, the same day we announced a similar deal.
So how do you rank things that are flowing in real time? I mean, how do you begin to grapple with that?
Well, the actual technical answer is secret, business secret, but basically we use the relationship between the tweets has value analogous to the way the relationship of the web does.
Along the lines of the number of people getting, receiving, subscribing to that?
That's usually a bad metric. The reason is that
Shaquille O'Neal is the answer to everything.
Yes, if we were to use that, what would happen is a million computers would sign up, and then all of a sudden, whatever that thing would be would get promoted to the top. So we've learned that we have to use things which are not spammable. In other words, we have to use structure of the information that exists. And if you work really, really hard within each of these information corpuses, you can actually find a hierarchy that makes sense.
You're sucking up millions of books, digitizing them, and have announced that you will also sell books. Will you kill Amazon? And you've put out your own sort of a smartphone. Will you kill the iPhone?
No and no.
Why not?
Well, let me finish answering his question. With respect to books, what we're doing is we're busy scanning out of copyright books, and also books that have sort of a lost copyright is the best way to describe it. We've done this so effectively, we were sued quite extensively a few years ago, and after a long and drawn-out negotiation have come up with a settlement which we believe will be approved in some form, either current or slightly modified form, very, very soon. Out of that, it'll be possible for so-called orphan works to be identified by people where the copyright has been lost and so forth. Books that are in copyright and controlled by publishers, we are only able to use if we have a contract with those publishers, and that's very careful to say that we respect their copyright. With respect to the phones, we have all these new phones coming in Android, and we'll see how successful that platform is. It looks like it's going to be pretty successful so far, and of course the iPhone is the category leader in that space, and I say that as a proud former member of the Apple board. Go ahead.
Question?
Thank you for coming. I think we're all energized by this talk and excited. If we're talking about re-engineering the world through information, I'm a corporate social responsibility consultant before I came to the business school, and I need Google's help. You were talking about the ROI on insulating your building, on really becoming socially responsible as a company. You guys have an incredible foundation that has a mix of for and non-for-profit as well that I would like for you to speak about. It'd be great if Google could help re-engineer the world in a sense of creating a database where we actually have information about social return on investment, which is so scarce, which companies do not publish, which I, as a corporate social responsibility consultant, have a hard time pitching to corporations because they want concrete numbers. So how do we create a world in which markets reward positive social attributes, which is starting to happen with climate change, but how do we make it happen at a grand scale?
Great question. Thank you.
I think the simplest answer is that corporate social responsibility is good for your shareholders, and anything that's good for your shareholders, the CEO should be focused on. And the reason it's good for your shareholders is you get a higher quality of employee who cares a lot more about what they're doing and why they're working. Again, Michael sort of foresaw this in a lot of his work. And the fact of the matter is that you're going to have a better financial and business outcome with employees that feel the way that you do and that we at Google do. So the things that Google could do, the only thing I can come up with is for us to set an example, to invest in the parts of the industry, because we have cash, we can invest and actually try to seed the market, and also help popularize it with our own statistics. We're not in the construction of databases business. That's what the web is about. But I think if we can provide the data, other people can follow as well.
Thank you very much. We reached the end of our time nearly here. It's been really interesting to look back both on Michael Hammer's life. Is there another question I should go?
Right over here.
Oh, yes, please. Sorry.
Yes, thanks again. Thank you for coming. My question is, it's become clear over the past 6 months that Microsoft is serious about this search space, and they've made a deal with Yahoo. And I just wonder generally if you could comment on how you view your competition and whether or not you view Microsoft as having some sort of chance still in the search space. And I guess more importantly, does Steve Ballmer frighten you just a little bit?
I'm not going to comment about Steve, and I'm also not going to provide any advice to Microsoft. We at Google don't really focus so much on our competitors. It's true we have studied what Microsoft is doing, but a lesson from business is that you should focus on what you do best and do it better than anybody else. And all of the companies, you asked earlier what people were worried about, what I was worried about inside of Google, and I didn't really answer that question.
Yeah.
What I really worry about at Google is our own non-performance. I don't really worry about our competitors in Microsoft and Yahoo, because Google is in a wonderful position that if we can continue to stick to our values and be the innovator in these spaces, we can stay ahead. And I think that's the best way for us to answer that question. And I'm not going to talk about Steve and Microsoft.
Is there one more?
Hi there. I want to leave the last word for Dr. Hammer, which is one of the lessons I learned from him is that one of the mistakes many companies make is that they fail to plan for extreme success. So they'll think about everything that goes wrong, everything that could go wrong. They have a plan A, they've got a plan B, a plan C, but they don't think about the plan A+. Google is an example of one of the few companies who's had a A+. Did you and Larry and Sergey sit around and think about what happens if we actually achieve everything we're setting out to achieve and more, and how do we prepare for a runaway success and scale for that?
Thank you.
I think in our case, Larry and Sergey were unusual founders in that they started with a global vision of what they were trying to do. And so every decision that was made with a factor of 10 of scalability or a factor of 100 of capability. So rather than accepting a current generation of hardware, you'd get the next generation, and constantly pushing for faster and more scalable solutions. I do think that as you quoted Michael, his diagnosis was correct, and I hope that Google can be an example of his prescription. And I would argue furthermore that if we fail to do that, we are toast. That's how fundamental his observation is.
Final thoughts on this day, at this event, with this gathering?
I'm proud to be a member of this community, and I'm very, very happy that you were able to, I know you just literally got off the radio and rushed over here. It's pretty special to hear you in person and see you in person. But I'm really glad to have participated in a pretty important event in my life.
Well, in honor of Michael Hammer, and with gratitude to you for being here today, our thanks to you, Eric Schmidt, and thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to everyone.